Welcome everyone, Costin here, continuing my Legendary Lord tier list for Total War Warhammer 3. We're moving on to D tier. Now, with regards to Warriors of Chaos and the Wood Elves, I will do a separate video for them just because they're a pretty special case in the sense that they don't play like any other race in the game at the moment. So we've gone from S tier to A to B to C, and now we are on to D. So first off, I will introduce Marcus Wolfhard on D tier. If you're going to play an Imperial campaign and Empire is pretty terrible, I would recommend Marcus Wolfhard. The reason is, even though the hostility meter is pretty terrible to deal with, he does gain a great deal of power through Imperial supplies, which will give him high-level units. You can get greatswords, you can get huntsmen, you can get cannons and Hellstorm rocket batteries pretty quickly in your campaign, far faster than any other Legendary Lord of the Empire, which gives him significant advantages. On top of that, he has 4 special heroes. I wouldn't call them legendary heroes because they're not legendary heroes, but he does have 4 special heroes in his campaign that he can get access to pretty quickly. So that is a good amount of power, and right now I think he is the best Imperial campaign, even if it is still overall pretty terrible. It's just not as bad as the other Imperial campaigns at the moment in the game. Then we have Nakari. Yes, Nakari is going to be in D tier. Some people rank Nakari a lot higher. Personally, I think Slaanesh is really weak. Don't get me wrong, I think Nakari's campaign can be a great deal of fun for like 30 turns as you're fighting the entirety of Wolfhard and trying to conquer it, and then you can steamroll the entire campaign map. That doesn't make it great, however, because you end up in that situation where with Nakari, because of the poor casualty replenishment, not so great economy, you're going to have a lot of issues in this campaign. Sure, the vassalization can make it work in a lot of ways, and it is a campaign that can work. That's the crucial part of it. It's not complete and utter misery throughout, but I do feel that demons right now are in a pretty bad spot, which is, hey, this is why Creative Assembly is going to start reworking them. Like, you look at the DLCs, that the 2 DLCs that we know that are going to come out this year, one in summer, one in December, pretty much, they're reworking 2 of the demonic factions already in the game. The 2 worst, Tzeentch and Nurgle, but I do expect both Slaanesh and Khorne to also be reworked. Speaking about Khorne, yes, I would also introduce Skarbrand at D tier. Oh, but Skarbrand is an S tier Legendary Lord. Why? Because he can win battles. I'm going to say this out loud. You can win battles as any freaking Legendary Lord, and oh, but you can win battles faster than anyone else. Okay, if you enjoy a campaign where the way to optimize your Legendary Lord is to fight 100 different battles throughout the entire campaign, great. I know there are people who are like that. I am not like that, because I think that the vast majority of battles that are in a campaign are utter rubbish. They're not fun, they're not engaging, they don't require any critical thinking. And Skarbrand is very much the kind of campaign where the tactics you're using in battles are very simplistic and very boring. Oh, enjoy cycle charging Skarbrand in battle after battle, or just literally building an entire stack of Chaos Warriors and hurling them at the enemy. So it is not a great campaign. It's a one pony trick. The trick does work, to be clear. The blood toasts do work. The movement range they get after raising settlements does work, but it is a fairly limited campaign all the same, and not really a great design one. I understand why people like it. Like, it is fun to sometimes, just throw an entire stack or a dozen stacks at the enemy and just wipe them out. But again, it's just one trick that he's got up his sleeve. He will not build a massive empire on the campaign map. He's always going to rely on just sacking and looting settlements and raising settlements for income. He's not going to generate any kind of income. He's not going to hold a lot of territory. And you're not really going to recruit any of the good, interesting units of Khorne. Like, you want to play a better Khorne campaign? Play Valkyrie. You get all the same units that Skarbrand does have. In point of fact, you will generally get more of those units because, shockingly enough, you can actually recruit them. Whereas if you're playing Skarbrand, yeah, you're basically like your entire campaign more or less is going to be playing with like units that you can recruit very early on, because building higher level settlements is just not something you can easily do in this campaign. Or even if you do, it is pretty awful to try and actually build an empire as Skarbrand on the campaign map. You can win it in a short number of turns, quote unquote, but you're probably going to actually spend a lot more time playing this campaign than many other campaigns in the game, at least if we're talking about any high difficulty. Then we have Aranessa, who I view as being the best legendary lord of the Vampire Coast. Now, the Vampire Coast is a pretty awful race, but the reason they're an awful race is, yes, you have powerful army abilities, yes, you have powerful magic. Okay, if you don't have it with the legendary lord, and you shouldn't really build up magic on the legendary lords, I think it's always better on the legendary lords to either focus on their melee potential or to focus on their army potential, like their army skills or the blue line, not magic, like magic get that on heroes, right? But the thing is, while certainly the Vampire Coast has that, they are incredibly limited in terms of their campaign, their economy, which is something that does affect Aranessa. Holding a lot of territory, especially territory that aren't port settlements, is incredibly limited. Now, Aranessa's starting position is such a nature that she actually does have a lot of ports next to her. Like, the best thing you can do as Aranessa is, like, yeah, you defeat Tylea, sure, but then you sell that territory to Ikaclaw, make an alliance with him, maybe put up a pirate cove if you so want to, in some of that, but then you head over to beat up Rapunzel and Arc in the Black, because guess what, there's a lot of ports in that particular area. But the important bit here with Aranessa isn't just like the campaign situation. Like, we could, like, Noctilus has an amazing campaign situation because he starts, like, with the settlement in the middle of the map and has a lot of flexibility on the campaign map. No, what is important with Aranessa is that the Vampire Coast, the biggest issue beyond just their limited economy and the fact that their hero capacity can only be increased by pirate coves, etc. The biggest issue is that the Vampire Coast unit roster, with except like depth guard and artillery, is utter rubbish. Like, their entire infantry line, with the exception of depth guard, is rubbish. Their monsters, yeah, they can work, but they're really, really expensive. And you can say, oh, Necrophic Colossi and depth guard. You're talking about a race that has a limited economy, and you want to argue about units that cost 300 per turn. This is the reason Aranessa is good, because she has the Sartosa Free Company. Now, Sartosa Free Company aren't great units overall, but they're kind of on the same level as Hobgoblin Cutthroats, and Chaos Dwarves use those just fine in their campaigns, which actually achieve a lot in the early game. So Aranessa actually has an army of units that don't have the piss poor leadership of the undead units that won't crumble, so you won't lose them all after a battle, so you can go from battle to battle and actually fight. So she's better not resolved, she's actually better with her army battle. Okay, she doesn't have the same instant death of magical ability as Silostra, for instance. Okay, that's fair enough, but actually having good armies, and it's not just one army that Aranessa has, and this is the important thing. I don't care how good one army a legendary lord can have. I care about how good they can have it in 10 armies. And Aranessa will have a much better in 10 armies than either Noctilus or Silostra. In Warhammer 2, different situation, because Warhammer 2 was more about limited armies, and in that context it made sense. But when Warhammer 3, where you're trying to build up a lot of armies to conquer a significant portion of the world as quickly as possible, Aranessa is just a vastly superior choice compared to the other legendary lords of the Vampire Coast. But I understand a lot of people are going to disagree with that. That's their perspective. Then we have Kastaltin of Kislev. Kislev is not as bad as the dwarves or the Empire, but it's still in a pretty bad spot. If you're going to play a Kislev campaign, well, I would recommend playing Boris Ursus, but outside of that, Kastaltin is the better choice. Katrin just is terrible. Not that Kastaltin is that much better necessarily, he still has to deal with the supporter system. He just has a better starting situation because he doesn't have to deal with the same issues that Katrin has. I'll just give you an idea. If you're playing Kastaltin, you have to deal with Zazel, you have to deal with Front, you have to deal with Tronk. If you're playing Katrin, you have to deal with all of those anyway, and you then have two other major issues in your campaign potentially. I say potentially because it's not guaranteed, but it very well could happen. And also Kastaltin just ends up at the moment having better faction effects and lord effects than Katrin. Poor Katrin. I mean, in Realms of Chaos, it is a completely different situation. Katrin is by far the vastly superior choice to both Boris and Kastaltin, but not in Immortal Empires. Then we move on to TicToe of the Lizardmen. when Immortal Empires came out, a lot of people were like praising this guy, but I think time has shown that he isn't really that great. The flying units he has, yes, okay, he does have a good amount of flying power, but flying power doesn't necessarily matter as much as you might think. Like, I would rather have a full army of Saurus or whatever the Cult of Sota can conjure up, rather than just focusing on the flying units. He's also in a pretty difficult starting position where, well, not so difficult because he's not quite in the Thunderdome 2.0 over there that's happening in Camry, but he's pretty close to it, and he does have issues. And also his campaign ends up being awful because guess what, you're going to have to deal with Kairos. Yeah, that is a fun experience to have to engage in a campaign. It's like, oh yeah, let me head over to Southern Cast Waste. It does affect the Cult of Sotik as well, but at least the Cult of Sotik actually has a lot more campaign power than TicToe. Flying units, the issue is, like, it does work to a certain extent, especially in the early game, but then, like, building a massive empire, just like what the other Lizardmen Legendary Lords can offer, like Gorak or Krokar or Tenuin or Oxyatl, what they can offer is just vastly superior. Then we have Foregrim Grudgebearer, and he's like Grombrindle. He helps his race make up for some of its weaknesses. In Grombrindle's case, it is the significant amount of campaign movement range, casualty replenishment he's offering into his entire faction. In Foregrim's case is the growth, the better commandments, which ultimately results in better growth. That is the significant part. On top of that, because of his Lord skill line, he is actually going to give dwarves extra hero capacity, which is pretty damn useful when you're considering how difficult it is for the dwarves to get to higher level settlements to actually increase the hero capacity. So Foregrim, like, if you're playing a dwarf campaign, I would say, like, Grombrindle is the best by far and away, but Grombrindle is limited in the fact that he can't actually reach the other dwarves, or it will be very difficult. Whereas Foregrim, with the exception of Grombrindle, Foregrim starts next to each other dwarves, and he does have the ability to confederate all of them. So with Foregrim, you're not just getting, like, Foregrim himself, you can also get Belagar, you can also get Ungrim. They're not too great to play their own campaigns, but they are worth, at least Belagar absolutely is worth confederating. So if you're playing a dwarf campaign, it's either Grombrindle or Foregrim. Short term, Grombrindle. More longer term, Foregrim. And hey, if you get the recruited defeat the Legendary Lord's mod, hey, you can even get Grombrindle. That would be my advice if you're playing a dwarf campaign. Then we have Norska, both Norska and Legendary Lords. Now, this is an interesting one to talk about, because if we're thinking about Trog and if we're thinking about Wulfric, they're not bad themselves as Legendary Lords. In fact, they're actually pretty solid. The problem is Norska is pretty busted as a race, as in literally their campaign mechanics do not currently work. The monster hunts are bugged to hell. Their economy doesn't make sense. Another issue on top of that is the fact that when you're, like, their mechanic with cast favor made sense in Warhammer 1, not so much in Warhammer 3. In the sense, you're in that trouble spot where in Warhammer 1, obviously, you had severe limits on which kind of territories you could take, right, in a Norscan campaign outside of Norska. It's not quite the same problem in Warhammer 3, but the issue for Norska is they have this dynamic where they do rely on sacking settlements for income, but they also want to raise those settlements to get favor with the gods in order to get campaign benefits and win the campaign. It just doesn't work because you need the money to maintain armies, but you also need to get the favor of the chaos gods. And on top of that, Norska is heavily dependent right now on ports for income, and the problem with that is ports are very vulnerable. They may not attack on land across large distances, but they will attack via sea, so that makes defending as Norska an absolute nightmare in any campaign that you're playing as. And right now their campaigns just feel broken completely. Like, it's one thing to talk about the Empire or the Dwarves or any other faction where they're just weak. Norska is not necessarily weak. No, they have a pretty great unit roster. Though it does suck and auto-resolve, but it's pretty powerful in the actual battles. But no, that's not the problem with Norska. The issue with Norska is their campaign mechanics just don't work all that well. Or just don't work, flat out. Anyway, that's it for now. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. They're still F tier, and then I'm going to do Warriors of Chaos and the Wood Elves in a separate video.